session is on the Crux of Kargil, and we have Ahmed Rashid with us, Naseem Zahra, Myra McDonald, and Michelle Hussain, who will be discussing the insights on peace and warfare found in Naseem's book. It's called From Kargil to the Coup, Events That Shook Pakistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, can everyone, yes, our microphones are working so everyone can hear me. So, real pleasure to be here. Congratulations, Razi and the LLF team on bringing the festival back here for another year. I'm delighted to be moderating this session, which is inspired, really, at least the moment. The reason we're talking about it right now is because of Naseem's book, which has just been published. I want to start with a bit of a recap, because it'll be 20 years next summer since the period that we remember as the Kargil conflict. Kargil itself, for anyone who doesn't know, is the district surrounding a town that lies just on the Indian side of the line of control. And what happened in what the world became aware of in May 1999, really the first thing that most people knew was that there started to be Indian airstrikes on positions that India said had been occupied by Pakistani soldiers, and then things went on from that point, and it was a very, very tense few months. So nearly 20 years on, Naseem Zahra, Pakistani journalist, commentator, analyst and author, has really done a meticulous piece of work on From Kargil to the Coup, events that shook Pakistan, and she has many eyewitness insider accounts from that time. And I'm also delighted to welcome two seasoned commentators on South Asia and beyond. Ahmed Rashid is probably best known for writing the book that everyone, including the American president, was reading after 9/11, Taliban, but also the author of 4 other books on Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia, regular wise voice on the airwaves. And Myra McDonald, journalist and author specializing in South Asian politics and security. She was a correspondent with Reuters for many years and wrote a book called Heights of Madness about Siachen, which remains the world's highest battlefield, and also another, Defeat as an Orphan, How Pakistan Lost the Great South Asian War. So welcome to you all. Naseem Zahra, I'm going to ask you to start really by, I guess, taking us back to that summer, and if you can, in broad terms, what happened in your conclusions nearly 20 years on?
Huge task. First of all, thank you very much, Razi and the LLF team, for putting this together, for inviting me, and for inviting me to talk about this book. A work very close to my heart. I worked on it for 14 years. 14 long years, and while I was doing other stuff as well, obviously, and my family and my friends would all say, so what are you doing? I mean, this is going to take forever. And I just want to say that I never got bored working on this for even 1 minute. I enjoyed every bit of it. And why did I enjoy it so much? And why was I so committed to it? Because in 1999, when this operation, this kind of operation, when it came to light and when it suddenly erupted on the scene, even somebody like me, when I say even somebody like me, because I used to work on security affairs, I thought this is something that actually it's the Kashmiri Mujahideen who were doing it. And then it was a story that was sold by the Pakistani state at that point, that it was actually the Kashmiri Mujahideen, and I even wrote articles then, to the effect that this time around Kashmir should be, run by the Kashmiris and so on and so forth. And then as things began to unfold, it was, I think, within a span of 50 days, literally, from 16th of May till July 4th, when finally Pakistani troops decided to withdraw, when Nawaz Sharif went to Washington. In that period, what I witnessed and personally witnessed, I was able to meet the Prime Minister during Kargil during these 50 days, and I was able to meet General Musharraf. I was able to meet Tariq Fatmi, Mr. Tariq Fatmi was key in the Foreign Office then. I was just kind of as events unfolded, I was amazed, I was aghast, I couldn't believe what I was witnessing. You know, it seemed like not a fairy tale, but a nightmare. It just, so much of it was so fictional, you couldn't believe that. And as I was witnessing it, I was saying to myself, how can a state behave like this? How can...
And the reason, because essentially they were regular Pakistani soldiers who were sent across the line.
Okay, so the bottom line on that was, glad you interrupted because I can go on and on. The bottom line on this was that actually 4 or 5 generals decided that because Pakistan was now a nuclear state, because Pakistan and India both had nuclear weapons, that if the Pakistani army went and controlled the lifeline, the Indian lifeline from Srinagar, KKH-1, from Srinagar to Indian Ladakh, where Indian troops were based, if it was controlled through interdiction, etc., the world will come and say, oh, so much, there's potential nuclear war going to take place, so they'll come and they'll say, Indians sit down and talk to the Pakistanis on Kashmir. I mean, it was as simple and as ridiculous. I mean, this is what it was. And I mean, this book came out based on hundreds of interviews, and I interviewed Pakistanis, Indians, Americans, etc., plus events that were taking place. So, so the objective of an operation like this, which was hidden, I mean, and this too is based on a lot of research. So the Prime Minister of the country did not know about it, except 4 army generals, and then subsequently 5th. Nobody knew about what was being planned. It was surreptitiously planned. End of November, the planning began in 1990.
The year before.
1999 November, 1998 November, it began 1999 February. One of the high points was a promising moment between India and Pakistan in terms of the Lahore summit, and things were happening.
Yes, so because Vajpayee had come to Pakistan earlier in that. Okay, just before I turn to Ahmed and Myra for their reflections on that time and what we've learned since. I mean, I was shocked. I remember being sent by the BBC's young producer at that time, and I had not realized how many men on both sides died in Kargil. I mean, it's thousands. It's about 2,000 Indians. It's as many as 6,000 Pakistanis. Ahmed, just take us back. I mean, Naseem mentioned the nuclear-armed state. The nuclear test had happened just the year before.
The nuclear test had happened a few months before. And in fact, I think the shock to the international community was that this infiltration into Indian Kashmir was being made at a time when the army, the Pakistan army, was in fact, if you like, using the nuclear umbrella to say, we're going in, you can't hit us across the land border because we've got nuclear weapons, you've got nuclear weapons, so, allow us to do this incursion, as it were. And I think if you look back, I mean, when you talk to the international community and all, they really trace their mistrust of Pakistan's nuclear program from this incident of using the nuclear weapons as a kind of umbrella to go into Kargil. And it's been very shattering, and I don't think we have really rebuilt the kind of trust. For example, India is treated now almost as a partner with the P5, the countries who have nuclear weapons. Pakistan is not treated like that. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is that there was no institutional consultation. As Naseem clearly points out, the 4 generals, the Navy was not informed, the Air Force was not informed, ISI, the intelligence organization, was not informed. And she has done a brilliant job of showing, the discrepancies. She quotes senior generals. She quotes from the cabal of 4, as she calls it, who ran this operation. And quite frankly, I mean, I don't think there's been another book on any of the 4 wars that Pakistan has fought with India as good as this one. Because she doesn't just concentrate on Pakistan, she covers what was happening in Delhi, what was happening in Washington, in London. It's an all-inclusive book.
And Myra, the Indians were taken completely by surprise.
Yes, they were. And they were also in a slightly awkward position of the Vajpayee, the Prime Minister, had just lost a vote of confidence in Parliament, and therefore he was going into an election campaign. So it added to the general sort of intensity of the Indian response that Vajpayee could not be made to look stupid. Because, I mean, I've been on those mountains on both sides and flown over by helicopter and driven the road from Kargil to Leh. They are incredibly remote. Some of you will know them, but you would not actually know that there are men up on those posts because it is so far away.
And indeed, you'd written about Siachen, which had happened, I mean, a decade before, really.
Yes, and I think perhaps because of Siachen, I'm marginally less critical of Pakistan over Kargil than most people. I'm extremely critical of Pakistan policy generally. But when it comes to Siachen, was on balance, there was, as ever, fault on both sides. But on balance, Siachen was caused by the Indian side. And in going up to another uninhabited area in 1984. And it's fair to say the Pakistan army was incredibly bruised by this because India had occupied this land in May 1984 and in April.
And it was land no one thought that it was worth going to or being interested in.
Going to. And the Pakistanis then fought very hard to get them out again and discovered that you simply cannot dislodge troops who are in a higher position in that kind of terrain. So while I do think the nuclear context and everything else made Kargil incredibly irrational, I would give them some little kind of mitigation in the sense that what they were trying to do in Kargil was relatively similar to what India had done in Siachen. The big difference is that they had miscalculated the impact of the nuclear tests on how the outside world would react.
Yes. And yes.
Yeah, just very quickly, a couple of things. Just in terms of India being taken by surprise, the 15th Corps commander of Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, his people were saying something is happening on the other side, and he had asked his brigade commander there to set up a zoo in Leh, and he refused to focus on what his brigadiers were saying, that something is happening. Instead, he was saying, you complete the zoo that I've asked you to build. So the
zoo is not a code for something. The zoo is actually a zoo.
Okay, a real zoo. So the Indians on that side were, also let me just very quickly on the book itself, you know, this book is really about, just to pick up from what Myra said, this book is about flawed decision making and the kind of missteps you take when something as serious as a policy with India is concerned. This book is not about saying Kargil was an immoral or a wrong thing, not at all. In fact, I raised this issue with the Indian Defense Minister. He's quoted in this book. I said, look, what Pakistan did in Kargil, you did in Siachen. So his words were quoted here. He said it's a question of who can get away with it. So this book is about flawed decision making in Pakistan. It is not about an incorrect policy towards India. That's another debate we can discuss.
Okay. And Emma, the key person in all of this is Pervez Musharraf.
Well, the key person is, Pervez Musharraf and three other generals around him. But of course, the other key person...
He was the army chief.
Sorry?
He was the army chief at the time.
Yeah, he was the army chief. And the other key person who, of course, Naseem writes about is Nawaz Sharif, who was prime minister. And he was not properly briefed. I think this comes out... There's been a lot of controversy. Did Nawaz Sharif know? Did he not know? And I think what you say very clearly is that he was briefed, but very badly briefed. He had a limited understanding of military strategy and tactics. He didn't understand the maps that were shown to him. And the only, the first time he really felt the impact of what was going on was when he visited the wounded in a hospital.
Yeah.
He visited the wounded soldiers who were coming down from the mountains, and he suddenly realized that this was a war and with India. And then he goes back to the generals and says, well, what are you doing?
Yeah.
He goes back to Musharraf.
But Naseem, the question is also that balance, bad brief or limited understanding, or is it both?
Well, I think think the first time Nawaz Sharif gets a proper briefing is 16th of May. By that time, this is 5 months into the operation. So in fact, if you were to ask yourselves that did he get a briefing at the correct time before the operation was started, the answer is no. The other thing is that the operation...
Even in broad terms?
No, not at all. I mean, this is based on, as I said, I mean, talking to a lot of people in the army, outside of the army, he did not get a briefing. And the other thing is the operation ran into mission creep because, they found nobody was there, and these soldiers kept going on, and the brigade commanders and General Javed Hassan, if I was to pinpoint one person who's the guy who instigated all of this, and then General Musharraf, because he's the army chief, the buck stops at him. It was General Javed Hassan, but obviously institutionally that you can get away with something like this is important. But when Nawaz Sharif discovers, and when Kargil ends, what does Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif do? He does not hold an inquiry or anything. He gives General Musharraf another position. In addition to being the army chief, he is made into the chairman, joint chief of staff, so he holds 2 posts. So I think that it's really a book about Pakistanis looking at how we're making decisions, and is it civil versus the military, or is it a more responsible way of taking the country forward?
Mara, to go back to the inhospitable terrain, what you were talking about, I mean, for the Indians to regain control of this area, even with airstrikes, was incredibly difficult.
It was phenomenally difficult, and I think there's one point it's worth stressing is that if you ever watch any of the films about Kargil, the Indians have made some Bollywood films. It tends to make it look quite glamorous, this kind of glamorous hand-to-hand fighting and lots of heroism. I mean, the reality is that, more than half of the people, of the casualties were from artillery fire. It's a ghastly way of fighting. There is no cover. You're pinned down during the day. You can only move at night. You are suffering from altitude. You can't eat. You're thirsty. And you're bleeding to death, basically, because they can't even rescue you during the day. So it's a ghastly war, and I think, just as a little side reflection, I often think it would benefit India and Pakistan to have a little bit more focus on how awful these wars are, in a bit the same way that Britain did with its World War I poetry, actually realizing that this is quite horrible. The Indians were also got lucky. And this is often one of the random effects of war in the mountains. The Indians were very lucky with the weather when they went into Siachen. Pakistan was unlucky with the weather in some of its counterattacks in Siachen. And then in Kargil, because there'd been a relatively mild winter, the passes on the Indian side of Kargil opened rather earlier than expected, unusual, which meant that India could get its artillery and its Bofors guns up towards the Dras Kargil area and target them on the Pakistani troops. So, it wouldn't have worked anyway, but the reason it ended up so badly also came down to luck. And that is, luck and the weather absolutely defines those kind of wars and that kind of terrain.
The bits I found absolutely heartbreaking is thinking about those soldiers who have occupied those posts and who are then essentially who are then abandoned to all intents and purposes because they can't be resupplied and
not only resupplied, I think they can't come back. No, they weren't because in the beginning the basically story was that these are mujahideen. So when the Indians in Delhi were handing back some of the dead bodies of our Pakistani soldiers, our High Commission went in and said, these aren't our people, until the policy was changed. So I think, and let me tell you that if, I'm sure in the history of, in the annals of war, this is going to, in time, go down, as far as the young Pakistani soldiers were concerned. This was absolutely this was a superhuman thing that they did. I mean, the more I read about it, the more I talked to people, I couldn't believe that they had 17,000, 18,000 feet high. They had taken helicopters in, they had gone and actually set up a war theater of sorts. I mean, it's not a regular war theater, but how these young men went and fought the battle, and when they wanted volunteers, when they needed 100, 10,000 would volunteer to go and fight. So I mean, the brilliance, the commitment, dedication of the Pakistani soldier is just remarkable, and every time I was writing about it, I mean, it was heartbreaking, because look at, and these guys should have been tried, these men who sent them to war.
The generals.
The 4 generals, and for no reason they were sent to war.
Well, I mean, there was an inquiry in India, there was no inquiry in Pakistan.
No, there was an inquiry, and that will obviously come out in the next edition. You know, the interesting thing is that... no, just a minute. Guys, I have no interest in selling any book or edition. No, I think I'm very committed to this issue, and I'll tell you, when this book, this is what I was going to tell you, when this book came out, I was shocked, because I thought that I'm going to be cursed roundly in Pakistan for it. I thought that people are going to attack me, and alhamdulillah, you know, people even within the army, from within the army, have received it very well. I've got all types of responses, people, and when I said second edition, because somebody came and then told me in detail that a report was written by General Javed Hassan. He got together the commanding officers, and they wrote a report in which they said that the young officers who were out fighting, 71 of them were responsible for the debacle. And then when the report came to the GHQ, they said, are you mad? These guys have, you know, lost their lives. So what I'm saying is, it is such a macabre thing. It's such a, I hope there's some learning inside Pakistan, but the fact that there are people there in the army who've read it, who understand it, who recognize it, and retired army chiefs have said to me that it's 95% of it is correct. What I'm saying, it's not guys, you don't have to buy this book. This is not at all a sales pitch. This issue is so critical for us in Pakistan to understand how decision making is so critical, and how I think anyway.
Yeah, Ahmed, I want to ask you. You said that the mistrust of Pakistan on the international stage started from that point. So I want to ask more about the aftermath of Kargil. So within a few months, Musharraf is in power.
I mean, within a few months, the perpetrator of Kargil, Musharraf, sacks the prime minister. I mean, he does a coup and takes over power. And Pakistan is in the doghouse with the Americans, with the international community. There's no explanation from Musharraf, public explanation.
But he was emboldened.
Sorry?
He was emboldened by...
Yes, well, I mean, he did not want to be sacked. Remember, before Nawaz Sharif was planning to sack him, before that Nawaz Sharif had sacked the previous army chief, General Karamat. Musharraf didn't want to go down the same way, and he had a corps of generals around him who were supportive of ousting Nawaz Sharif. So it was real sort of Macbeth type of Shakespearean daggers drawn on both sides. But I think the real lesson was that the person who should have been in the dock for carrying out Kargil became president. I mean, and it was a real tragedy. I mean. And really very, very sad.
Yeah. Each one of the 4 generals got promoted, were put in key positions, and it wasn't just one General Musharraf.
Sorry, if I can just add one thing about the nuclear thing. Immediately after this, the Americans get into the act. The Americans are more worried than anyone else, and President Bush then persuades the army to accept safeguards for nuclear weapons, and it's all very secret. We don't know exactly what were the safeguards, what happened, but the Americans spent something like $100 million in providing Pakistan with safeguards, because the Americans obviously thought, well, we can't snub Pakistan now because they've used this nuclear threat. We have to accommodate them and see what we can do to safeguard the nuclear weapons. So actually there's a huge effort by the international community to get Pakistan to put in these kinds of safeguards, which I presume can be monitored by the international community.
Okay, I want to actually turn to questions here. So are we doing this with microphones, or are people just asking questions? Okay, could you raise your hands if you've got a question? So I'll come to you, and then, these two gentlemen here. Go ahead.
Hi. I'm somebody myself from Jammu and Kashmir, so for me, this is a very, very emotive topic, like the West Bank and Gaza is to Palestinians. And I think we can't lose sight of the fact that in 1947 we were given the right for self-determination to choose whether to become part of Pakistan or India. This is still in force in the United Nations. The Indians say that the referendum needs Pakistani troops to pull out first, which is not going to be done because the Indian Constitution says that all of Jammu and Kashmir is theirs, and therefore if Pakistan leaves without India agreeing to the referendum, they will walk in. And at the end of the day, how many times in the international community, you're saying, Ahmed Rashid, with all due respect, that we had to be put in line, we were in the doghouse. How many times has the international community supported Jammu and Kashmir right to self-determination? Never. 1962, India lost the war against China. China said walk in to Pakistan. America threatened Pakistan at the same time.
Took us to talks.
It's all about Pakistan, India, and I'm very patriotic and I believe, that Kashmir should be part of Pakistan. That's my individual view, but people should be, right to self-determination, whether it's Pakistan, independence, or India. And the way I see it is that don't forget that there are people living in these areas. There are people that you don't need to remember. Indian occupied Kashmir, Armed Forces Special Power Act, Kunan Pashpur and mass rapes in the early 90s. Which Pakistani journalists are talking about that? Who's going to talk about Kunan Pashpur? Who's going to... And Myra, I saw your response to a Kashmiri who had been killed by the Indian Army on social media, where you said there might be a reason why the Indian Army were dragging him along the ground.
It's a misquote, by the way, of what I said.
How about the people of the area? At the end of the
day, can I just ask, thank you. I'm just going to ask Myra, do you want to set that straight, and then I'll go to the gentleman over there?
No, because setting straight what a misinterpretation on social media would take us an hour.
Fine, thank you.
I would like to respond to that question, please. I think that you're absolutely right. I agree with you. This is why I said this book is not about Pakistan's India policy. In this book, I argue very clearly that Kashmir is critical. It needs to be resolved. We keep running into problems, and every word you said I agree with. Let's carry on.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. My question is, do you believe that lessons have been learned from Kargil? And have you witnessed in your interviews that there is now a formal change in policies? Sorry, I'll repeat. Do you believe that lessons have been learned from Kargil to avoid this in the future?
Okay.
And in your interviews, have you come across any formal acknowledgement of changing policies to make sure that this doesn't happen again?
Okay. Can I just ask, maybe just Nassim, before you answer the book specific, I wonder actually, Myra and Ahmed, if you can both, maybe from, both the side of what have lessons been learned in India and have lessons been learned in Pakistan. Myra, what do you think?
Well, I can actually probably answer both the Kashmir comment and your comment on this, is that in terms of the international community, was very, very supportive of the peace talks that went on between India and Pakistan from 2003 to around 2007. And I've interviewed everybody who was involved in that. That was a very good roadmap for peace in Kashmir. And then in terms of lessons learned, the reason why that ended up dead was because of the Mumbai attacks in 2008 and Pakistan's failure to follow up the Mumbai attacks, which means that it's been impossible to get that up and running again. In terms of lessons learned, Pakistan continues to misunderstand the international community and its response. It completely miscalculated in Kargil in thinking the international community would rally to its side. It did exactly the same and continues to do the same about the Mumbai attacks, where if you go around all the other countries, including China, they're very clear that Pakistan had a responsibility in Mumbai and needs to take action against those involved in it. And yet within Pakistan, there remains this denial. So I don't think there's been any lessons learned. We've waited 20 years for congratulations on your book on Kargil, but there is still so much obfuscation, misunderstanding of India and misunderstanding of the outside world.
I wonder if, maybe not outwardly admitting it, but whether it's the army or politicians. I mean, this was a...
if you look at the state of the border today, in divided Kashmir or even the international border, the level of shooting and violence from both sides, hitting villages, killing civilians, is huge. And God forbid, any one of these incidents could lead to some major massacre of civilians or some senior army officers being killed, and then God knows what the reaction of the other side would be. So, and remember that, I mean, since Modi came in, Modi has refused to discuss anything with Pakistan of any meaning. And for 4 years now, we're in a state of limbo where Indians and Pakistanis are not getting visas for each other's country. There is no communication. I've just attended a conference where the head of the party secretary of the BJP, the ruling party in India, he spent 45 minutes discussing the region and did not mention Pakistan once. And so their idea of Pakistan is just ignore it, pretend it's not there. But then, you know, we've seen the killing in the valley and what is happening in the valley, and the bird shot that is being used to blind women and children and all the rest of it. So, I mean, I don't see, I agree with you, I don't think lessons have been learned. Any one of these incidents could explode into something major.
Yeah, I think that some lessons are learned, so that, I mean, in terms of the flag, in terms of the response, reaction, etc., I don't see another Kargil happening, that anything has taken place institutionally within the army. They always say that no operation can take place without clearance. So obviously that stays where it is. In terms of the competence of the Pakistan elected leadership, that's critical. As far as the international community is concerned, Ahmed, it seems to me and Myra that there is a realization that the international community is not going to come and stand by Pakistan's side on this issue, even on Kashmir. And I mean, I think if we are all so upset about, and rightly upset about, the Arab journalist, Saudi Arabian journalist who's been slaughtered to death, just imagine what happens in Kashmir all the time. And this is Indian media reports. These are not something that I'm saying, what happens in terms of, Burhanuddin Wani onwards. So that issue has to be resolved. Pakistan realizes that, and Ahmed is absolutely correct. Since Mr. Modi came in, when Nawaz Sharif went in at his inaugural, Pakistan has bent backwards over. Yes, Pathankot took place, yes, Mumbai took place, but then yes, you have Kulbhushan Yadav, then you have Balochistan operations by the Indians, then you have Samjhota Express. So what I'm saying is, we can't go and fix what's happened, but the point is that dialogue is critical for the Kashmiris, it's critical for us, and who's at this point not wanting to go into a dialogue? You think Imran Khan on his own decided to offer dialogue? The Pakistani establishment was behind him as well. So I think that there's some learning that India needs to do, but as far as the elections, Indian elections are concerned, you may see that afterwards, not before.
Let's go to the gentleman.
I've heard a very apt description of a gruesome comedy of errors. The question is why did these 4 generals go into this case? Was it basically a miscalculation? Or was it, as I have observed, maybe talking to some of these generals in the past, that they're trying to readdress the humiliation they faced in East Pakistan when they lost it? And so is it not worthwhile to actually explore in more detail what is leading to these events, rather than describing individual ones and say we should learn lessons?
Naseem, why did they do it?
Yeah, why did they do it? Because, you can't even, for even your own decision, you can't look at one reason for it. There are multiple reasons. The nuclear thing was important, the history is important, but within the Pakistan army, and I've discussed that in detail, within the Pakistan army, there are 2 points of view. I mean, there were generals who pulled back their own, commanders who went across the LOC, even to set up a single post, they were pulled back. So it's not like the entire army is a monolith and decides that Kargil is the right thing to do. The other thing is that all these 4 generals had served in that area, and this was an old plan that was there during Benazir's time. It was picked up, and also Kargil was on the Pakistani side before 1971. Kargil was taken by the Indians in 71. So a whole lot of things that took place.
Very simply, I mean, there was this idea that we can get away with this and there'll be no repercussions. and the international community will finally wake up and come to help us resolve the Kashmir.
Get away with it means they thought they were going to hang on to that territory, which effectively redraws the line.
They thought redraw the line and force the UN, the Americans, etc., to come in and negotiate.
So therefore you internationalize it, which India's never wanted.
I'm just going to say one more thing that I think is really important, and again, the only time I defend Pakistan is over this. That plan was kicking around from the 1980s as a response to Siachen. And if you look at a map, it's actually relatively difficult to get the topology. But Siachen started quite small in 84, and then the battlefield got bigger and bigger because both sides are constantly trying to take high positions. And by the time of the Kargil War, the Siachen battlefield had actually sprawled all the way out to overlap with the line of control. Even India had done some little maneuvers across the line of control as well. So if you could take the nuclear thing out of that, and of course you can't, but if you could, it was actually a relatively legitimate response to Kargil.
Because there's all sorts of things going on all the time, you mean?
It happens all the time. The LOC is really on fire, and in don't forget that in 1989, there was a near agreement. In fact, Rajiv Gandhi and Benazir were there, and on Siachen there was an agreement, and then the Indians pulled out of it. In 2006, there was an agreement in Siachen, the Indians pulled out of it. In this case, I think, and in terms of misreading the international community, on 24th of June 1999, when General Zini arrived to meet General Musharraf and ask him to pull out and pull back, I met General Musharraf the same evening, and he said, General Zini really understands our position, and he understands that without Kashmir this can't be resolved. So, I mean, misreading and living in cuckoo land and...
Sorry, just one more point. I think, again, if you see where Siachen is and where Kargil is, the obvious thing to do, if you look at where Siachen is, the Indian supply, it's here, and the Indian supply lines go like that. So if you can't get them off the mountain, the most obvious thing to do, and this was written in many notes through the late 80s, the obvious thing to do is to attack their supply lines. You don't have to be a military expert to think that. So it really comes down to their failure to recognize the impact of the nuclear tests. If they had done it in the 80s, in the late 80s, I think they might have got away with it, yeah.
But also, I mean, it was such a, it was such a crazy, the legitimacy is always going to be established by the sanity of what you're doing. So if, of course, I mean, on Kashmir, on 1971, all of that, as a Pakistani, I think Kashmir is critical and has to be resolved. But I mean, as a Pakistani, I'm saying, what the hell are these guys doing on such an important issue? Yeah. What a plan.
But Emma, just going back, you said right at the beginning, and obviously Naseem looks at this in her book, about that even ISI, even the intelligence services didn't know, which I'm just trying to comprehend. You've got thousands of troops going over the board, over a period of time that these maneuvers are taking place. Yeah. I mean, for that not to have gone through the whole of the military establishment seems extraordinary.
Yes, I mean, it's the first time in history that something like that has happened. I mean, frankly, that your own army is not aware, your Navy and Air Force are not aware of what is happening. The first time the Air Force got involved when Indian helicopters and planes started flying over the troops the Pakistani troops in Kargil. It's possible because the army is extremely hierarchical, it's extremely secretive. There are many operations that are going on all the time which are generally hidden from the rest of the army and from the public. So, I mean, it was quite feasible. And remember, the troops up in the north, the troops they used were troops from the northern region. Yeah. So it's not that they were shipping in troops from Karachi or from Lahore or somewhere like that. So that was the main reason.
And there were 700.
We haven't got many minutes left, so I'm going to get a few. Yeah. Lady there.
Hi, thank you very much for this insightful background, what's happened in Kargil. My question is a very common question that is raised quite often in nowadays, that it's an understood reality that army in Pakistan has a very influential or very powerful control over many matters, and your book, Naseem, reaffirms that kind of notion that they went into this battle without Prime Minister of the country having not briefed properly. So is this, I think Ahmed just has kind of touched upon it, that this again reaffirms the hierarchy and the secretive nature of the army of Pakistan. So recently, this notion has been again applied, that implied that in these recent elections Imran Khan has just won. There was a very strong army hand behind it.
Is that your question?
This is my question, that is your book reaffirming this notion that yes, army has a very strong control, and the democracy in Pakistan is just by name?
Okay. Thank you.
There is an asymmetry of power in Pakistan, there's no question about it. But what's the answer to that? The answer to that is more democracy and more competent elected leadership. There is no other answer, and yes, I think to some extent Imran Khan was helped in.
Okay, can we just get 2 more questions and then we'll come back? So if you get the microphone to the gentleman here, and Emma, do you want to answer in the meantime?
Yeah, I just want to say one thing, and that is that if you look at the history of Pakistan the last 30, 40 years, the history can be encapsulated as the conflict between civil and military authority. And invariably the military authority wins, each stage.
Why and what to do is the next question. Why and what to do is the next question.
So mine was just a brief follow-up, Ahmed, to Michelle's question. I mean, it just beggars belief that the intelligence wing of the army would have been unaware. Can you say something about that? That's just astounding, particularly given the perhaps exaggerated or reputation of the ISI, which is that they are ubiquitous and one of the most well-orchestrated intelligence operations in the world.
Thank you. And while Ahmed answers that, can we get a microphone to the gentleman in the white shirt?
Well, there is so much going on the LOC at any given moment. Troop movements, firing, mine blasts, civilians moving here and there. I mean, the LOC has been a firecracker for the last 20, 30 years. So, unusual troop movements on the LOC or even further north would not necessarily be looked at with enormous suspicion by, and anyway, I mean, the ISI would defer to the corps commander of the northern region, who was Javed Hassan, and, this activity would not be seen as something unusual.
I just want to add one quick, if I may. Just on facts, how were they able to get away with it? There were not more than 700-800 soldiers that went across the LOC, it was in thousands. Number 2, the corps commander, 10 corps, under him this entire region comes, and he was General Mahmood, who was part of the clique of generals who decided to do this. And as Ahmed says, a lot keeps happening along the LOC, and in NLI movement was not noticed. So it was, and when the intel people, couple of them picked it up, the intel chief was General Ehsan, he took the matter up to General Musharraf, and the guy from intel who reported it was really pulled up and asked to shut up. So they kind of contained the whole situation like that.
Yes.
In an age of data-free assertions, Naseem, congratulations on a very well-researched book. I'm more curious about the reaction of the current head of army and the top generals, as well as the new prime minister. If word has gotten back to you on what the reaction is to your book and everything that comes out from that, the learnings.
General Bajwa said he knew a lot about Kargil, and that's that. As far as a serving general wrote a long note to me saying, this is great, putting it together, and it's correct. As far as the current Prime Minister is concerned, 2 months before he became Prime Minister, when I handed him the book, he said, and he's an old friend because I was in the party at one time, I handed him the book, his only question was, who's the hero in it, Nawaz Sharif or General Musharraf? And I said, none of them are the heroes. So he said, then okay. So I'm sure he hasn't read it.
But Naseem, did any of the 4 key, did any of them talk to you on the record?
Of course, I mean, otherwise it would have been fiction. Of course I spoke to General Musharraf, 2 or 3 sittings I had on this. Then with General Javed Hassan, And this is really, General Javed Hassan, when I went to meet him, you know that he was elevated, he was made Corps Commander Gujranwala after this disaster, then he became NDU President, I don't know, anyway, so I met him at NDU, and he had a 2-hour-long discussion, he gave me all the facts, and as I was getting up to leave, he said, who's asked you to write this book? So I said, don't insult me. So I think he gave me all the facts thinking, I know what he thought, but yeah, so of course I've spoken to them. Yeah.
Well, many congratulations on 14 years of work that went into the book. Thank you. And many thanks. Thank you also to Ahmed and to Myra McDonald. Thank you all.
Well done.